Hello and welcome to Vision Denial and World Watch 2022. My name is Sam, and for those who are new to this, I watched every single playoff game of all 11 playoff regions. Yes, including that one. I'll just readjust. Haha, now I'm centered. We finished all the playoffs at this point. Yes, I'm about a week late. 6 days to be specifically, but a week and a half ahead of point. Nice. For those who want to catch it, who caught it, all of the particular reviews that I've done are on a TikTok, which I will link below. But we're going to be watching the rest of the playoffs, specifically the Order versus Pentanet GG game, which happened on... Oh, dearie me. I actually don't remember when that happened. I got lost. Yes. Order versus Pentanet GG, which was the September 2nd, the fourth game, or the fourth series of that day, up until the end, with September 11th, with the last one being Cloud9 versus 100 Thieves, right before the picking stage. Take a look. That's about 23 series that I'll be playing afterwards, all of which I put up on the TikToks already, but for your amusement, you get to watch over here. Sooner after, possibly during the week, I'll be setting up a lot of different videos, including with all the different teams. But after watching the reviews, I want to talk about some interesting things regarding drafts, some of my worries about the timing of all the tournaments happening, and the draws themselves. Without further ado, let's take a look at the first series of this week. It's the semifinals of the Oceania's LCO. We've got Pentanet.gg versus Order on a rematch that doesn't go usually how most rematches go. I mean, it's rare to see rematches go one-sided, but from the loser hitting back. In this situation, Order just kind of looked lost, rarely having the vision to make any plays, not addressing either team's win conditions, rushed neutrals, lack of coordination, and just overall a lot of passivity from them. There's an aspect here that would make it seem like Pentanet had a huge upgrade of some sort, and honestly, it's not really. It doesn't look that way. Pentanet found the time to have some solid vision control and applied the win conditions consistently. They had more coordination, and the recipe for this particular series is done. Their wave manipulation, however, was fairly excellent. All of this was really bizarre because, honestly, from Pentanet, their drafts were much harder to execute overall, but they didn't really have to execute it or do even a lot to get to the point where they were hitting any win condition. Order, with their much simpler drafts, had the priority to be proactive and assure the scaling for their teams functioned in their favor, but instead looked like most of the team just kind of woke up today and gave up. Just straight up gave up. Given that, I would say it's kind of hard to tell if Pentanet will do well against the Chiefs. And possibly, but like, given how little they actually played to their win condition, like Pentanet didn't have to do very much to their win conditions. They were just given extra win conditions. I don't think they will do well against the Chiefs. Right? I'm not very optimistic from that. And I'm, especially since I don't think the Chiefs would allow them to have what they happened today. Shout out to Balkan and Pradith, who had such solid performances overall, especially in the smaller skirmishes of the game. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the losers final. No, it's like the losers quarterfinals. It's like the before the semifinals, the quarterfinals. It's the quarterfinals of the Southeast Asians PCS with Paris Saint-Germain Talons versus Deep Cross Gaming. It was an interesting matchup, I gotta say the least. Honestly, if you give the Talons 30 minutes and a dream, they'll win anything. Which is a shame, because if they are too far behind, they don't do anything. Good thing they were up against Deep Cross, because they can just wait and they'll stop doing anything at 30 minutes. These two teams are foils of each other, where the Talons have great vision control but shoddy vision denial. Deep Cross have great vision denial but shoddy vision control, where Deep Cross play very lane-centric, the Talons play very macro-oriented. And the issue here is, I think that neither team would do well at Worlds. Just, if either of these teams qualified for Worlds, I wouldn't think of it, of them doing anything. And at this point, it's a shame, because the biggest change is, how would Deep Cross get better at closing out games, and how would the Talons get better at being proactive during the early game? If somehow the Talons make the adjustment for their series against Beyond Gaming, then we might have a solid team going into Worlds. But as far as I can see right now, we have teams who have coordination in just one stage of the game, and at any other, they are either disjointed at best or far too behind the pace at worst. I have a feeling that the Talons will take the second slot at Worlds, but that's mostly looking at the matchup with Beyond Gaming, who likely won't be able to keep up with the late game pressure that the Talons show. Which, to be fair, the Talons show an excellent late game approach. I just wish that it matched the rest of the game. Shout out to Unified and Gory, who were hallmarks of the success they managed late game. Let's take a look at the next series.
It's the semifinals for the Vietnamese VCS. We've got GAM Esports versus Team Secret. And congratulations to GAM on being the 15th team to qualify for Worlds. No one should be surprised. You'd be hard-pressed to think that that there was going to be any other result for this series. But Secret did surprise me in the first half of Game 1, where Team Secret had more consistent vision, stronger draft, and a proper approach to the win condition. The second they started misplaying by the late stage of Game 1 is when it started to get worse from then during. And then as that happened for the series, it just got better for GAM across the series. Now, Team Secret had a sense of cohesion, but as the series went on, the team had weaker vision play, sloppy dives, and teamfight approaches, and just began walking in a line to just get killed instead of playing around GAM's slower early game. Now, GAM still show proactivity overall and an incredible understanding of the limits of their draft, and I found myself very mesmerized, oftentimes not even typing, when they approach neutral objectives. The level of coordination to find the vision setup, start the objective, secure it, turn, all in one swift, synchronized motion, like a machine almost, is something really to behold. Which is a shame, because that's not the team we saw against the Buffaloes, or even in Game 1 of this series. But given the slow build-up that GAM had across for the summer season, it's not surprising if coming this finals against the Buffaloes, they, for their rematch series, no matter on top of it, they would turn it around. Because at this moment, the way they played out this series, they look unstoppable. Shout out to Katsi and Levy, who controlled the early game tempo and zoning of all of the fights. Let's take a look at the next series. We're back to Europe with LEC's round 2 of the lower bracket. We've got Fnatic versus Misfts Gaming. And congratulations to Fnatic on being the 16th team to qualify for Worlds. And a moment's silence to Misfits, who played their last game as an organization. Alright, moment's done. There is nothing more certain than death, taxes, and Fnatic making it to Worlds. Fnatic sped run through this entire series with a clear understanding of where they wanted to put their win conditions and how to get there. Misfits, for their part, did not look prepared to confront the aggression brought to them. That said, Fnatic was not efficient and often found themselves to be overzealous, cocky, leading to wild and chaotic fights that Misfits took full advantage of. And when Misfits had control of the tempo and of a lead even, they navigated the map in fairly excellent ways. The issue really comes from the hesitation and limitation of the drafts that they put up. Neon is still the main focus, and if it wasn't ahead in some way, then Misfits still struggled to get around any of the proper priorities. Fnatic were incredibly entertaining with how they outmaneuvered, but this looked like a case of that they could do it this way because the plan of attack specifically targeted Misfits' weaknesses outright. And if Fnatic play to attack the weaknesses of Mad Lions on their next series, then this should be fun. And if it's just them playing fast and loose out of a skill check, then I have concern for their prospect at Worlds, really. It's an unfortunate situation that this is the series that Misfits have to leave their mark. But one hell of a mark it was. Shout out to Razark and Wonder, who really outmaneuvered all of Misfits. Let's take a look at the next series. All right. We're back to North America with the lower bracket, where we've got Evil Geniuses versus Team Solo Mid. And I hate saying this, but like, as a fairly big TSM hater, I still preferred the way that they approached the game, especially over Evil Geniuses. Now that said, Team Solo Mid were still inconsistent with the approach. They had stronger vision, side lane controlled, stronger neutral approach, and excellent drafting, but that doesn't matter in situations where they only work when ahead in golden tempo. When Team Solo Mid play ahead, it spoils and enriches, but when behind, they're caught in a drought of doing nothing at all. Evil Geniuses, for their part, were significantly more proactive on the plays, but the vision is usually shallow, and their drafts force them into significantly harder to play scenarios than needed. Team Solo Mid looked like they did their homework, while Evil Geniuses play like they just so happened to own the answer card to the test, and yet still doesn't follow the answers. Evil Geniuses regularly drafted compositions with win conditions that they just wouldn't lean into. And just so you know, that's a lot of 1-3-1 drafts just to ignore the side lanes completely and just really attack the mid lane just as an ARAM. Like, why draft side lane control if you're not going to use them to control the side lanes? From what I see here, I'm not particularly a fan of the possible third team the LCS is going to be sending for Worlds. Between Evil Geniuses' drafting choices and how they avoid playing them properly, and Team Liquid needing to warm up 2 games in their series, it's not looking super good for the third seed of the LCS. Shout out to Inspired and Impact, who held a lot of control and sway in the top half of the map and the jungle. Let's take a look at the next series. We're back to China's LPL in the regional qualifiers, the lowest of the lowest low brackets and playoffs. We've got LNG Esports versus Victory 5 or V5. And honestly, like, LNG are an enigma. On paper, they shouldn't be able to make this miracle run, and yet, here we are. V5 had more consistent vision play, significant better neutral setups, and overall better coordination, asterisk. But the clutch factor from LNG is too strong. From always playing the limits of the side lane control to the absolute dedication to move forward on any play, regardless of how messy it could be. And the team fights being so even from both teams across the board are an absolute joy to watch in this series. I think what really makes the clutch factor for LNG so strong is their ability to minimize loss efficiently, to be fully prepared on the next play. So often do some of the members stop to disengage whenever a bad play comes in to give a lot of time for carries to escape, or spend an extended amount of time to poke and delay victory 5 so that even when, they may lose an objective or any particular play, they can be prepared for the next one much faster. V5, for their part, had the unfortunate nature of, regardless of how good they were across the board, of needing 2 games to warm up before hitting that mark that we recognized them in. And this time, as opposed to other teams who take that time to warm up in a series, they came up short in game 4. No matter how good you look in a series, if you take 2 games to get there, it's not great. Any small particular mistake is going to cost you. Now, whether LNG's clutch factor comes up big against the Royals, who are rather hungry to get to Worlds, is really up in the air, because on paper, no, the Royals should have this easy. In application, well, let's see, it's really up to LNG. Shout out to Ala and Doinby, who created so much space and opportunities for the team to play their style. Take a look at the next series. It's the last playoff series for the LCK in Korea. We've got DRX versus Liiv Sandbox in a stunning turn of events. Congratulations to DRX, who are the 17th team to qualify for Worlds. Result literally no one expected. Liiv Sandbox had such a strong early game approach and solid coordination, but somehow were super inconsistent coming into today's matchup. Looking back at the previous series these two teams played against each other, it was clear that Liiv Sandbox outmaneuvered and outfought DRX at any given turn. But over here in this one, the Sandbox fumble draft choices. They fumble an entire game. They allow DRX the full flexibility to play how they want at the pace that they want for 0 extra cost. Now, DRX, for their part, put in Pyosik for some reason in one game, and it didn't do very much for them. But once Juhan is in, it's just like the team is completely transformed. Early game is proactive and engaged. This version is just a lot more consistent, and when ahead, they don't lose pressure around the map, a issue that they regularly had with the previous version of this roster. The sub made a huge difference, as neutral fights and early jungle skirmishes were the make or break of any given game within this series. The one thing that leaves me a little concerned is how the pace of the game is so slow for DRX. Many of the other teams going into Worlds will be playing at such a breakneck speed that DRX may never get the chance to play their style. But the style of side lane controls and zoning teams out of neutral objectives is a fairly good look for them. Shout out to Juhan, who is a lifesaver for this team, and Kingan, who really outmaneuvered Dove for map pressure and really enabled this side lane control win condition for them. Let's take a look at the next series. It's Southeast Asia's PCS's semifinals. We've got MegaBank Beyond Gaming versus Paris Saint-Germain Talons in a very close, stylistically similar situations. Congratulations to Beyond Gaming on being the 18th team to qualify for Worlds. They almost threw it, allowing themselves in a situation in which the Talons were poised to reverse sweep them. Instead, they remained firm in their approach towards vision, side lane control, and neutral skirmishes, all fairly excellent. The thing, however, is that both teams here hold similar approaches to the game, and regardless of who won between the two, I don't think the final results or the finals results will change. I don't think either team would do better against the Flying Oysters. The only difference here is that the Talons seem less coordinated and require a lot more time to ramp up at a series, which is not great. Both teams also have fairly lack proactivity around the mid to late game. Early game, their proactivity is fine. There's a lot of approaches that they work with here that are fairly excellent, but once that's finished, they shake hands and opt to let the other side scale, which is kind of ridiculous given the kinds of drafts that they would give each other, which is purposefully scaling. The leads accrued early game, guys, need to go somewhere, but instead, either team would be instead of either team doing something about it, it was just a matter of time where one team made a mistake first and then capitalize on it. Beyond Gaming being the exception sometimes, which made a lot of difference in this matchup. Hopefully, the strange pacing that this team provides can be fixed before they head to Worlds, or they won't be having a great time. Shout out to Husha and Likai, who purposely created a whole lot of space during some of these team fights in a way that didn't let the Talons breathe or approach them. Let's take a look at the next series. We head off into the upper bracket semifinals for Europe's LEC, where we've got G2 versus Rogue. And God, G2, what a terrifying team. G2 find ways to keep tempo control no matter their position. Solid vision, excellent team fight coordination, smart map movement. They've got everything and anything you want in a particular team at this moment. The whole package. I think their drafts and overconfidence will get punished when they head to Worlds, but right now, no team seems to know how to handle them in the LEC. I like seeing games like this because even the slower ones, G2 can show what a low-kill, high proactive team looks like. It's not about just getting kills themselves or doing like gank plays. It's about how you collect resources that matters, more than just waiting for neutrals to spawn and either expect a fight or just securing it without contest. G2 right now show me that they look like a top 4 teams at Worlds, especially if they keep up this kind of form in their next series in the finals for the LEC. Rogue, for their part, looked mostly lost, disorganized, and uncoordinated, especially during team fights. The first few minutes in the early game for them are pretty well planned out, and they have a solid idea of what their win conditions are, but the lack of proactivity really hurt, especially against a team like G2, who, when you just let them have control of the tempo, really run away with it. Rogue will have a chance to avoid play-ins at Worlds in their next series, but if the lack of proactivity stays as it is, then it might be really rough for them. Shout out to Targamas and Caps, who really manipulated the team fights in rather dizzying ways. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the Brazilian CBLOL's Grand Finals and a rematch 2-in-1 combo. I love these. Where we've got Loud versus Pain Gaming. And congratulations to Loud on being the 19th team to qualify for Worlds. Where in the previous time these two teams have met, I had mentioned that Loud was a lot more consistent as a team, but super indecisive, and that Pain was inconsistent but decisive to a fault. Well, for Pain, that seems to have disappeared as the confidence from them was nowhere to be seen, and the coordination from Loud was in full force this time, and decisively. better at the setups for neutrals, stronger approach to team fights, a lot more active in the mid game, solid vision play. Of all the teams that the CBLOL is sending, I'm glad actually that it's loud, and in the version that we see them in the finals. I'm hoping that this decisiveness of the squad stays, because they'll still have to work on their proactivity. In the early game, it needs quite a bit of work. They do incredibly well to set up their win conditions and do have the tools necessary for any given neutral fights, but those are usually done as a response to their opponents who are regularly first there, or they're answering a play on the other side of the map. Once mid-game rolls around, they're more proactive, and coordination and consistency shines through regarding that. But the teams at Worlds won't give them the chance to passively play out the laning phase like they did here, or even just to answer. Loud bring a solid, consistent style from the CBLOL, and it should be fantastic to watch at Worlds, who are used to a lot more wild and chaotic version of the Brazilian league. Shout out to Seos and Robo, who continuously disrupted all angles of attack that Pain had to offer. Let's take a look at the next series. We're off in North America's LCS's upper bracket semifinals. We've got Cloud9 versus 100 Thieves. And Cloud9 show us that patience can be a strong tool against a team that make quick, unflinchingly bad decisions. In this situation, the Thieves usually show, or usually have at least, stronger vision play, neutral setup, team fight coordination, not by a whole lot, not by much, but it's there. That advantage for them is there. What Cloud9 does, or at least what they excel in, is the macro decision making. So often, 100 Thieves would have either like a stronger control of the map, better draft, gold lead, and a Drake lead, and then make a bafflingly bad decision that just leaves them in a lose-lose scenario. Meanwhile, Cloud9 will find any minute disadvantage to keep trading up, and once they have a significant lead, they do so much work to suffocate the Thieves. And Cloud9 will avoid taking straight up fights against them because they know that they're not the stronger team for it. They instead just stack any given particular favor, like any particular situation in their favor like no tomorrow. Cloud9 are a fascinating team to watch from series to series. Seeing how they adapt themselves to their opponents, I just worry a little bit that they don't hold enough proactivity, as much of their play was still on the back of how 100 Thieves played in the same way that all of their other games were. Now that said, the Thieves have such a simple course correction for themselves. And just to be a fantastic thing, it's really down to either fixing their macro decisions and or drafting choices so that they can take something that fits within their style. With that, I could see the Thieves coming back to the finals and win a potential rematch against Cloud9. Shout out to Jensen and Blabber, who created so many small advantages that led to the stacked team fights in their favor. Take a look at the next series. It's the last lot for the Chinese LPL region. Into the last regional qualifier, we've got Royal Never Give Up versus LNG Esports, and congratulations on the Royals on keeping up a fine tradition of every MSI champion qualifying for Worlds, on being also the 20th team to qualify for Worlds. And I'm not going to lie here, I probably would have preferred that LNG qualified though. But the fact of the matter is that one team was proactive early game while the other one is proactive late game, and that's pretty much my only difference in what I prefer. Even if I rather the early game team to go, if they can't carry over that momentum to the late game, then it doesn't really matter how much of a lead they got. Whenever LNG play flawlessly, they look near unstoppable, while the Royals look like they are taking a step back and rolling over. But when the Royals look great, it's just them going through the motions of a solid standard League of Legends. Both teams play with fantastic vision approaches, side lane approaches, and I only slightly prefer the Royals' approach to neutrals as it's less risky. And that's the key word here in this series, is that the Royals take less risks. So their proactivity is subtle and slow, while teams like LNG are going to really push the envelope with tempo and momentum. The lower-seeded teams, going into Worlds at least, will have a lot to contend with against the Royals, as this team really sets the bar for what's expected in this tournament. If you can beat the Royals at Worlds, you're likely to make bracket stage. Otherwise, most of the other top teams you will have an incredibly rough time against. And that's just it, right? They're the gold standard for this. So, shout out to Wei and Xiaohu, who controlled the tempo of any given team fight, really routing LNG right where they want them, and likely about to do the same to a lot of emerging regions. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of the Japanese LJL. We got Detonation FocusMe versus Sengoku Gaming in another finals rematch. But this was not even close. Just not even close. Congratulations on Detonation FocusMe on being the 21st team to qualify for Worlds. This was so utterly one-sided. While early game Sengoku Gaming shows some signs of coordinations and proactivity that's really nice to look, or nice to see at least from them, it is clear that Detonation are in full control. Whatever led to Sengoku Gaming whatever lead that Sengoku Gaming would gain at first would be instantly lost by all laning phase advantages that are being accrued and set up by Detonation. Every decision served to make the team as a whole gain gold, while Sengoku Gaming would primarily focus on getting Jet ahead or getting some neutrals, but not building off of that. And also, just Jet would not hold any meaningful impact, and with the neutrals being tied so much later into the game, it is on top of the fact that Sengoku Gaming never held a gold lead during the entire series. The mid game comes around and breaks, and the mid game comes around, and the breaks just don't exist for Detonation FocusMe, as any small advantage is being pushed by them and any fight is taken. They have this nasty little habit of going a little too aggro on any given play, but given how Sengoku Gaming didn't know how to respond to anything being thrown at them, it didn't usually matter. This could become an issue against higher seeded teams at Worlds, who will gladly fight them on those terms, but given the context of this series, it didn't matter. Seeing the absolute confidence out of Detonation FocusMe and the fact that they did not throw once during the playoff series at this given moment has me hopeful about their performance at Worlds against some of the most emerging regions and some of the lower seeded teams of legacy regions. Really gonna be nice. Shout out to Yudapon and Yaharang, who were monster carries during the entire series. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of the Oceanic LCO. We've got the Chiefs versus Pentanet GG. And it wasn't quite as one-sided as expected. But congrats to the Chiefs on being the 22nd team to qualify for Worlds. If you looked at every game that the Chiefs played, you might think perfect team with solid execution, incredibly good vision play, solid team fight coordination, patient setup around neutrals, and good draft sense. And for the most part, you'd be right. But then, Pentanet comes along and shows the secret to the world. The Chiefs play mostly not to lose, instead of playing to win. Primarily in the early game at least. And it seems that the Chiefs have a serious lack of proactivity in the early game that causes this. That only really kicks in once the mid to late game, or once the mid game has rolled around. And only if they so happen to have a lead. Pentanet really show that the Chiefs have an incredibly strong have incredibly strong laners who rely on the fact that they're this good at laning phase to get by in the early game and accumulate leads just from laning phase alone and not much else. And while their mid to late game is incredibly solid, heading to Worlds, they won't get away with just being strong laners, as the caliber of the players are going to be incredibly high. Now, that's it again. The vision and neutral skirmishes are something to behold from the Chiefs. And while it isn't consistent, the Chiefs do play some interesting map movements and side lane control to create confusion and separation from their opponents. Which leads to the team fighting overall, which is really out of this world. A lot of team fighting teams are going to Worlds, and I can 100% see the Chiefs going toe-to-toe with them. The instant coordinated engages and layering of abilities is a sight to behold and is really fun to see. And we're going to get a chance to see it on the international stage. Shout out to Raze and Tally, who are really the big fars of how the Chiefs play their modus operandi. Let's take a look at the next series. We've got ourselves the Southeast Asian PCS Grand Finals and a rematch with the big bank battle. We got CTBC Flying Oysters versus MegaBank Beyond Gaming. And this is even more one-sided than the times these teams met previously. I think this is a necessary statement for the Flying Oysters to show that come hell or high water, they are strong competitors for the group stage. At moments it seemed like the Flying Oysters would lose from being over-aggressive, but regardless of how many lost fights there were, or how many lost fights there were just in early game, and primarily only in the early game, the Flying Oysters would garner even more leads across the map. In the impressive feats of total control from the first ban to the disrespectful fountain dive at Game 3, the Flying Oysters tell the world that they have a solid foundation with laning, vision play, neutral objectives, side lane, and wave manipulation, and most of all, individual as well as team fight coordination. Beyond Gaming, for their part, seemed incredibly disjointed and lost. They have solid vision play and neutral approach, but in matters of team fighting, laning, or even proactivity, they were just a cut below the Flying Oysters. I don't have strong confidence from Beyond Gaming that they'll be incredibly competitive in play-ins, having a hard time to deal with other teams with similar styles as the Flying Oysters, but they do have strong knack on how to answer plays and punish over aggression. They keep proactive even while behind, and that is an angle I can appreciate heading into the world stage where proactivity from ahead or behind is necessary, even if they weren't as strong as the Flying Oysters in that proactivity. It seems like the PCS is sending in some strong representatives heading into Worlds, and it will be a blast to see this new kind of style from the region. Shout out to Rest and Gemini, who caused so many issues for Beyond Gaming in their hopes to contest any early game advantages. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of the Vietnamese VCS and another rematch, but this time it's utterly one-sided. Holy shit. We've got Game Esports versus Saigon Buffaloes, and it is night and day for GAM, as their approach to the game has seemingly changed overnight. Where once there was this very side lane focus to the game, has now become a direct attack on how the Buffaloes approach theirs usually. Full Drake control was the MO. Not a single Drake was uncontested, and only one across all three games were lost. GAM knew how to play side lanes, and it was just a matter of scaling that became an issue for them, and they adjusted that right away. And once it was solved by really focusing on the Drakes for this series, it was just about being more coordinated and better at the setup. And GAM showed some of the strongest neutral setup for the early game that I have seen so far out of the teams that have qualified for Worlds. And the Buffaloes the entire time seemed rather lost and confused as to how to approach the series. Previously, the Buffaloes attacked GAM on their lack of attention towards neutrals, and once that was shown to no longer be the case from them, the Buffaloes were slow to adapt and even slower to answer any play that was put up in front of them. This is slightly concerning heading into Worlds, where many of the playing teams are very neutral team fight oriented and or play rather flexibly, and the lack of flexibility will be a large factor going into the tournament. And mind you, these two teams are solid under all accounts regarding vision, team fight approach, and everything else. But with 5, maybe 6 teams who look like they are strong contenders to go on to the group stage from play-ins, any slow adaptation means zero luck to get to that stage of the competition, let alone be competitive within groups. Honestly, really gonna be rough. Shout out to Cuddy and Style, who really navigated the space and maximized their damage. It was really fascinating to watch how they played up those team fights. Let's take a look at the next series. Round 3 of the lower bracket in Europe's LEC, we've got Fnatic versus Mad Lions. What about that game 1? Of all the ways that Fnatic put up a statement that they should be feared, the 19 minutes and 32-second game is for sure one of them. That game, however, is emblematic of the good and bad that comes from this squad. Fnatic have a very well coordinated effort for vision, dives, neutrals, and team fights. Super clean. Asterisk. Once someone is in, they're all in. And as great as that is, it's clear that the second that one person is a little out of line and their opponent is going to punish them, they're just going to double down, though. And that can make it even worse. This kind of play is great when super ahead, but while behind, it just makes the games end faster for teams who have a lot of proactivity themselves. Which leads us to the slow to act, but quick to react Mad Lions. Mad is a more consistent, with solid vision and wave manipulation kind of team, but they can't really keep up with Fnatic, who are a team that has 0 breaks overall. The level of proactivity that Fnatic has dwarfed whatever Mad could do to respond for it in situations where Fnatic were far ahead. Which doesn't help that Mad is a much slower team overall, because this kind of consistency that they showed us usually comes at the cost of a lot of proactivity, especially when behind. Both of these teams show problems that are going to be very easily exploited come Worlds unless they find ways to course correct. Mad with the lack of proactivity early in, and Fnatic with overcommitting so harshly. The faster teams are going to have their way with Mad, and the clean, measured, proactive teams are going to be more consistently punishing Fnatic for their approach. Shout out to Upset and Razark, who played so excellently in the early and late games to navigate so many of these fights. It's really nice. Take a look at the next series. It's it's like the quarterfinals in the lower bracket of North America's LCS, where we've got Evil Geniuses versus Team Liquid. Not so great choices for North America. I'm sorry, North America, this year you don't seem to have great prospects. Anywho, congratulations to Evil Geniuses on being the 23rd team to qualify for Worlds. Honestly, the look of both of these teams did not inspire much confidence for the region. Team Liquid are the more consistent of the two teams, especially in regards to vision, drafting, and side lane pressure. But whenever something needed to be a guarantee, Team Liquid falter, or too slow, or wait for the Geniuses to make a mistake instead of being proactive. Similarly, for Evil Geniuses, who are inconsistent as to when they want to be proactive and apply pressure, but are at least more consistent in regards to how they do team fighting and neutral objective setup. To me, the edge will always go to the team who plans and drafts with proactivity in mind. And while Team Liquid is a little safe for my liking, Evil Geniuses would still regularly overstep and overestimate the leads that they had, allowing Team Liquid to punish quickly and regain so much of what they would have lost based on their very defensive play. I like, at least, that it didn't take 2 games for Team Liquid to get going, but they still had issues with how they approached the late game. And Evil Geniuses don't require games to warm up in a series, so even if the series did go to 5 games, which it did, Team Liquid was on match point before Evil Geniuses, I do think that Evil Geniuses is still the better choice for NA, but from 2 choices that are rather rough, it's only slightly better at best. I do think that they'll do great against a lot of the lower-seeded teams going into Worlds, keeping them really on their toes, but the competition at Worlds is really rough this year, as in, like, they're really competitive, like, they're really strong this year, from at least what I've seen from the other 22 teams that have qualified. Shout out to Inspired and Jojo Pune, who really kept their counterparts under control and unable to perform. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the Turkish TCL Grand Finals with DenizBank Istanbul Wildcats versus Fenerbahçe Esports. And congratulations to the Wildcats on being the last team to qualify for Worlds. Honestly, though, I'm very impressed by the miracle run that Fenerbahçe pulled off, beating the 3rd seed and then the 1st seed, all as things looked bleak for them in every single one of those series. They kept up excellent wave management, solid vision control, and some beautiful coordinated team fighting when they were ahead in gold. Because the main thing here is that their proactivity and macro choices lag far behind their ability to punish mistakes and create winning team fights from nothing. While the Wildcats are incredibly aggressive in the early game, at least there is some proactivity from them. Speaking of, the vision denial and team fighting are solid from the Wildcats, but are often undercut by inconsistent approaches to neutral objectives and vision control, allowing so many opportunities to get punished by their opponents, notably Fenerbahçe, who really pushed the envelope on that. I also think that both teams being rather slow from the mid to late game, relying on neutral spawn timers to dictate the tempo, is a surefire way to allow any other team at Worlds to pounce non-stop on them. The Wildcats have a lot of grit and personality to their play, but I kind of worry that because they coast on early game aggression and strong team fighting, that all other aspects kind of fall short and will hurt them in the long run unless better late game approaches are learned. Doesn't look super great for the TCL this year. Shout out to Holy Phoenix and Saren, who really showed what it looks like to skirmish and team fight like a Wildcat. Let's take a look at the next series. And we head off to Europe's LEC semifinal, where we've got Rogue versus Fnatic. And something really clicked in Rogue and found the secret formula on how to stop Fnatic. The series showed that Fnatic very much relied on their early game strength, and that teams will meet them on that front so that they could excel and balloon that. And honestly, it worked for most of the time. Razork has been the stronger jungler during playoffs, but the adaptation from Malrong to avoid any unnecessary contest and really focus on the solo lanes, especially Odoamne and the Odoamne and Wonder matchup, made a huge difference. And it really helped that the solo laner, or that the laners in general, were really up to task to nullify any attempts from Razork to influence that particular matchup. Both teams had strong vision application, if not slightly shallow at times, and good understanding of neutral setups, but Fnatic lacked the restraint as to when they have to contest something. And when they were really far down in gold and pressure, they even wouldn't attempt any strong contest of some sort. It was really baffling. So the Fnatic that we saw coming from the lower bracket is still there, especially if Game 1 is any indication. And the fact that they are in the play-in stage for Worlds feels like a formality at best, as those teams should find them incredibly scary. And while Rogue, I don't think will have the bigger splash on the international stage, what I saw here was some genuine solid adaptation from them, and that right there is the hallmark of a fantastic team ready for Worlds. I just wish they were more consistent with their proactivity, as at times it seems like it's more of like they would more answer to Fnatic's movement than just kind of like apply their own. Or like apply their own like strategies right off the bat. Shout out to Larson and Comp, who controlled the space and deleted so many people during these fights. Holy cow, were they ever so confident in these. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the North American LCS's semifinals. We got 100 Thieves versus Evil Geniuses. And right off the bat, all right, shout out to Kairi, who stepped in for some from some big shoes on Evil Geniuses and came up super big. Excellent shit. That said, the Thieves really came in with a host of strategies that worked on different levels and were incredibly flexible all around. Both teams are inconsistent in terms of vision and side lane play, but are incredibly solid in terms of team fights and neutral setups. This is a fairly even matchup, which is a shame because these teams draft for side lane setups so often, and it rarely becomes relevant until Baron or Soul has been secured, and that they're so far up in golden tempo at this point that side lane pressure is really easy. And speaking of tempo, right, the pace of all of these 5 games was not dedicated by any of the teams, but by the timers of the neutral objectives, nothing else. None of these teams controlled the tempo of the game, which to me is concerning given how many teams around the world, or at least going to Worlds, have strong tempo control. There's a larger emphasis on upkeeping map pressure, and as good as that is, if all you're doing is allowing your opponent to keep up parity without ballooning gold outside of these neutral team fights, you'll be in for a rough time against some of these teams who don't quit well behind. I can appreciate the measured response that both teams have, though, during these team fights especially, really skirting around the limits as much as possible, which is something a lot of the other teams going into Worlds have trouble dealing with. Overall, either team winning in this series would have done the trick for me. Given the context of the North American scene, they're pretty solid, and Evil Geniuses going into play-ins feel like a formality more than anything else, and they are likely, keyword likely, to make it out of play-ins if they clean things up just a little bit. But there's a lot of good teams in play-ins. Shout out to Closer and Abadage, who controlled the tempo and space of every fight excellently. These were really solid team fights in this series. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of Europe's LEC and also a rematch. I love these so much. Where we've got Rogue versus G2. Holy shit, this series was awesome. Now, everyone thought that Rogue would lose to Fnatic, right? And when they didn't, everybody thought that they would get crushed by G2. Whoever this Rogue is, I like it. Much more consistent around neutrals, a much better early game approach, and better wave manipulation overall. And the flexibility is still there for this team. Now, in situations like this, it's easy to think, well, maybe G2 dropped the ball and Caps couldn't play to his standard. No, not at all. And that's what's so impressive about this. The early game from G2 is on par, if not better than Rogue's at some points. They also have solid approach to neutrals, better vision play overall, and Caps was more on form than ever as he has been the entire playoffs. There's no doubt that the G2 that we've seen previously is still the same team in this series than in the others. We just got a massive upgrade from Rogue. It's also in situations like this, though, that I have to put on my skeptic hat and wonder if Rogue will be able to continue this momentum heading into Worlds. If they do, then fantastic. This team looks like a top 4 team. Otherwise, if we get pre-Fnatic Rogue, we might find ourselves with a team set to face challenges beyond their capabilities, possibly. I'm hoping for the former, as that will make Worlds an interesting event, especially. I do think that Rogue are still a little too passive in the mid game, or at least in the mid to late game, and it allowed G2 to find a lot of chances to regain control during that time. But just from the sheer leads developed early, it usually didn't matter in this series. But it will matter on the international stage. Do keep that in mind. Shout out to Malrang, who really came back to a form. I haven't seen him in a long time. I really liked it. I missed this Malrang. And Comp, who took matters into his own hands to close out every game. It's really nice. And with that, let's take a look at the next series, also the last series of the summer 2022. It's the final series of the summer playoffs. In North America's LCSs, we got the grand final, which is also a rematch. Cloud9 versus 100 Thieves. And holy moly, was this really one-sided. The evolution of Cloud9 is something to behold and incredibly interesting. Momentum is super important going into Worlds, and that is a huge boost to do so, right? While both sides have solid vision play and early neutral approaches, the thing that really kicks it off is the proactivity that Cloud9 has looking for any opening, whether they are ahead or not. The Thieves regularly played drafts that made things difficult for them and wouldn't always play to their win conditions, but it didn't really stop their early games from being excellent regardless if they played for it or not. Once behind, though, it was clear that their drafts would still become an issue if they were not playing to their win conditions just altogether. Cloud9 have a lot to prove from this series. They look like the strongest team from the region, sure, but they also look like the most consistent from the region and with a proper approach to the game. I don't have much confidence that the Evil Geniuses or 100 Thieves will show strong competitive edge against the other teams from the legacy regions. But Cloud9 have the hallmarks to make it out of groups. Not confidently, but, if they continue to play with the limits that they use in team fights, the strong pressure established around neutrals, and the consistent proactive look for anything, that will move the game ahead, because that's just it. Using the proactive play is that Cloud9 is the only team in the LCS that didn't just let the game go into a lull from the mid game to the late game, making sure their leads meant something and to avoid relying on neutral timers while still holding strong control of them. We'll see who they end up being drawn with and if they can make a splash at groups, but otherwise, I may not have strong confidence they'll come out of groups, but they're the most likely team, I find. Shout out to Berserker and Jensen, who together created so much chaos and control for the team fights that 100 Thieves struggled to maneuver. And this is the final series of the summer playoffs. Now we just have to wait for Worlds. Take a look at my YouTube channel. And for those who are already watching the YouTube video, stick around. And that was everything. 383 games. And across 383 games, 128 champions, nearly the whole lot of it. I think about 80% or a little over 80% of all of the champions showed up in some way, shape, or form, picks, bans, either your pick or your ban, across every single one of these playoffs. It's really interesting, especially regarding the fact that, if you look at it as a whole, we got things like Wukong, Azir, Zeri, Kalista, and Sylas being on the top of the list. But that's across both patches that we're playing. And a lot of these are subject to change over time once the actual official patch comes out for Worlds. But it starts to get a little bit more interesting when you start splitting between the different patches. To be specific, only about 144 of the games were played on patch 12.14, while the other 239 were played on 12.15. Bizarrely enough, despite Kalista having such a huge impact on a lot of the different regions, the regions that played on 12.14 were the ones that leaned into it the most. And regarding the 12.15, a lot of the nerfs about Zeri came through, but was still the most picked across all of that. And Wukong, having been picked the most across both of the patches together, still didn't top the charts on either case. A common similarity still within all of these different picks are the ability to siege around neutral objectives and zone your opponents, re-engage and dive against them, or to have engage options altogether. This is not super hard to see in terms of the trends. Every region had this particular trend. You're either facing off against a Yuumi and a Lulu, who were paired off with either a Sivir or a Zeri. Really simple. The alternative is that you had a Kalista with some form of engage, either Nautilus or a Mumu, and then you had Lucian Nami. Right? The bottom line seems pretty simple. Anything else and everything that came around it more played to the styles of each particular team. Some teams were a lot more creative, the LCO being a standout for me, where the jungle and the top side usually had a lot more variety in terms of what was being offered. Well, the same thing with like the LPL, where different types of variety was still showing up, but it still showed the same kinds of junglers, Poppy, Vi, Trundle, Sejuani, things that really emphasized the ability to create a lot of zoning potential and to enable your bot lanes during the team fights. I am super interested into seeing where this goes over time. I really want to see if Sylas is still relevant, or if Azir and Zeri still stay the same, or if Sivir is pulled back a little bit. A lot of these major power picks I think are pretty healthy regarding the meta. It still doesn't super limit your players or your teams in one box, even though a lot of these teams really leaned into it. But I doubt that that's going to be the case. It's rare to see that the meta from the playoffs of every region's transitions to Worlds. Super rare that happens. But I'll be really interested to see whether or not, and like I mentioned in a video before, if the bad habits of drafting move on to the new patch, or if with the new patch a lot better habits come in, or if any of the same trends stick long term. Because sometimes patches can change a whole lot, but it doesn't change overall what is going to be picked. And there's a reason for this. There's a reason why my thought process goes here, and that's mostly because, and we'll talk about my concerns with the timing. Now, what do I mean by that? This year is unique in a lot of different ways, not especially the fact that the LCL can't participate. Really weird that the Commonwealth of Independent States, well, it's not really weird. It's understandable that the Commonwealth of Independent States can't participate. The timing of all of these particular tournaments, or these playoffs, are very close together. I've been watching every playoffs, whether or not in video format or writing, or just casually, for nearly 6 years now. 7 actually, I think. I've been doing it since 2015. Yeah, 7 years now. I've been doing it since 2015, and most of the time, there is a nearly 3-week buffer between the last team to qualify, or the last playoff series that's played, and Worlds. Usually. That tends to be the average. This year there is a week, there's like, not a week and a half, but there's, it ended on the 11th, and there is a week and a half. Straight up a week. Or sorry, it's 2 weeks and a half. So like, it's a shorter time frame. It is, I nitpick on this because it feels like it's every region was forced to play at the same time. Because near the end of this, there were a whole lot of games happening all at once, when that kind of pressure usually happens near the midpoint of all the playoffs. And it feels like a lot of the teams have very small amount of time to actually adjust, and we won't know about the actual patch 12.18 until the 21st, like patch 12.17 was released on the 7th of September. So yeah, we're going to know this about the 21st. The teams will literally have only 1 week. 1 week of preparation versus a whole month usually of actually practicing on the new patch or on the Worlds patch. There is so little time for any of these teams to be prepared that it makes it hard for me to believe what they say really. It says, with Worlds being played on patch 12.18, this is the last opportunity for us to introduce larger scale changes without significantly changing the current state of the meta in pro play. What? Riot, what do you mean? You're going to introduce a bunch of changes that you're going to assume are not going to make larger sweeping changes to the meta in pro play. Like, sometimes I'll give the benefit of the doubt. They don't always word these in the best way. And the way that these patches go through don't necessarily communicate what their small briefing does. They do a whole bunch of patches, and it's hard to do a lot of these like small fixes over time to try to avoid how teams play. And it's understandable. This is also a year where teams had 2 different patches to play as opposed to just the one patch. So it's kind of hard for any of the teams to really evaluate how, or it's not really hard, but it's going to be a little bit more tricky, or as far as I can tell, it's going to be trickier for the teams to really know how the meta is going to work out. And there's always usually this growing pain in the play-ins and group stages as to what the meta actually is at Worlds. I think this pain is going to be even worse. To me, the meta in Worlds is going to be as wild and chaotic as ever, which for some people is going to be great, but it leads into the other thing is that this particular Worlds was extra competitive. Or, sorry, this particular set of playoffs across the world were extra competitive. It was very rare that a team steamrolled across like the whole thing. The only few teams that I know that did, right, are in the LJL. We've got Detonation, FocusMe, steamrolled across the floor with it. And then we have in the LCO in Australia, or the Oceania, Chiefs steamrolled through it. Those are the only 2 teams that were dominant all throughout the entirety of playoffs. Every other team had some form of competition that they really had to navigate across, which to me is great. That sounds like we're going to have the same kind of like competitive edge that we had at Worlds last year. A lot of expectations are going to be like phased and people won't know what to expect, or it's going to be completely, utterly one-sided. And with the small timing of teams having to adjust to the new patch and how Riot is trying to aim to not change the patch to like change the meta too much, I am not confident that this will be a competitive Worlds. I feel like it's going to be a race between Gen G, JDG, top esports, and everybody else is going to have to try to keep up in some way or shape or form. But those are my immediate thoughts on that. Let's take a look, though, at the draws, because sometimes that largely affects a huge amount of how the tournament itself is going to look. So let's take a look at those. Let's take a look at the draws from the play-in stage. Let's start off with Group A. All right. When I saw this group, a lot of people are going, this is the easy group. I think this is the group with the most volatility. For starters, a lot of people are probably going to be sleeping on Beyond Gaming and Loud and Chief. And you know what? I'm not going to blame you a whole too much. Specifically with at least Beyond Gaming and Loud, they don't seem to be inspiring a whole lot of confidence in terms of like their consistency. But here's the thing. Loud was still the most consistent team in CBLOL's playoff run. They bring a nice, unique variety in terms of the way that they approach team fights. And Beyond Gaming were way more consistent in terms of at least facing off against the Flying Oysters and the Talons in terms of like skirting off a lot of the aggression that they had. The Chiefs, being utterly one-sided in their region, may have a lot harder time to navigate things. And Evil Geniuses equally will probably have a harder time, but that's because of their slower nature. Detonation, FocusMe, Chiefs, and Fnatic, all three of those teams are very high-tempo teams, which is something that Loud, Evil Geniuses, and Beyond Gaming are going to have a harder time contending with. So I think that there's going to be a lot of volatility within this particular group. The only notable exception here is that Fnatic, I don't see Fnatic having any competitors in this group. It would be wild to me to see Fnatic lose a single game across any of these teams. If they do, I think that'd speak a lot to the volatility. The only team that I could see doing that is Detonation, FocusMe. But that's from the whole prospect of this being a more volatile group overall. Group B, the one that people named the Group of Death, I think that Mad Lions and the Wildcats really got the short end of the stick. I think Esports will have a lot more fun time overall within this particular group, but I don't see them doing particularly well either. This is really a race between TRX, Royal Never Give Up, and Saigon Buffaloes. And the Buffaloes had a huge upgrade since MSI. And I mean huge. They have become a better, consistent team in terms of vision, in terms of the way that they play their objectives, in terms of the way that they go through their map movements. They became a lot better at facing off against GAM, which is in the upper groups, to a point where I'm fairly confident that they'll take at least one game against one of these two, like DRX or RNG. I'm confident in that statement. The thing is that I'm not going to put no stamp of approval guarantee here. I am not confident, however, that Mad is going to get out. And that's the thing with these two groups. If I was to really put money on it, which I'm not going to put money on it, I think that Fnatic, Beyond Gaming, and Detonation, FocusMe are the ones that would move on. And I think that in Group B, DRX, Royal Never Give Up, and Saigon Buffaloes are the ones that are going to move on. Which leaves literally the lowest seed of both North America and Europe to get kicked. And I don't give a lot of confidence in terms of the LCO representatives, the CBLOL representatives, the Turkish representatives in TCL, or the LLA representatives. And I think it's mostly from a variety of factors that I think like the Chiefs are probably the stronger out of those four, and I could see them getting a chance possibly to upset like Evil Geniuses. Not even a chance. I do think that the Chiefs could easily defeat Evil Geniuses. No doubt in my mind that could be a possibility. But I don't think that they're going to be consistent enough to really face off against Detonation, FocusMe, or Fnatic. But all of this is still, again, based off of what the patches come through. So who do I think would be the top four? I think that Royal Never Give Up is likely to be the top one for Group B, and Fnatic for Group A. Those would automatically go past, which leaves Saigon, Buffalo, and DRX versus Beyond Gaming and Detonation, FocusMe. And based on how things draw out, you could toss it in the air. I think that DRX is the most likely one to go out. And then depending on how things seed, then you would end up in a situation where, like, if Saigon, Buffalo, and Detonation, FocusMe are in the best of 5 against each other, I give the edge to the Buffaloes. But those are my immediate thoughts within the play-in stage. Let's take a look at the group stage hesitantly, because the group stages still require the actual confirmation of what the play-in stages are. Let's take a look at what that looks like. The group stages for me are also fairly interesting. For one, I apologize, Cloud9. I do think you were the best performing team for North America and that you have a silver lining in the situation, but then you got faced off against... I mean, you didn't have very many good options. Even if you were to face off against like the Flying Oysters or GAM, I don't think you would have done very well either way. And I think that's unfortunately due to just as a whole how North America approached things. But that's also, again, based off the playoffs and patch change and everything else. Given this, you do have an opening with some of these. T1, for example, have a slight tendency to be a little bit more inconsistent across all of the other LCK teams. And that's understandable. Although, the second they get a lead, you're kind of screwed. Edward Gaming, for their part, are hungry for their title again. They're returning champions. They're not going to really, like, settle down on anything. And they've shown time and time again of, like, reverse sweeping Royal Never Give Up twice in very decisive manners when they did do the reverse sweep. It is... what was the wording I put in for this again? It was... that's RNG. There's a lot of these. No, not that one. How did I miss it? There it is. What was the wording I put in here? It was... yeah, they looked a little bit lost and incapable of proving why they were top 3 in the upper bracket. And then their game 3 rolled around and the awful vision play becomes damn near perfect. The map movement that was questionable becomes consistent and cohesive. The team fighting, holy shit, was huge. The map movement to gain advantages while behind. Right. They all of a sudden turned on a switch, and every time they did the reverse sweep, where they just perfect information in every go. And I'm concerned because whenever Edward Gaming or T1 are ahead in some way or have control, it is very hard for them to let go. And Cloud9 are really good at coming back in situations where the other team did let go in some way, shape, or form. So I'm not super confident for them. I do think that regardless of who the 4th seed is, that T1 and Edward Gaming are probably going to move on from here. I think the notable exception here is if somehow Fnatic is the ones that go there, in which case it's a tighter race, but I don't think so. Group B is super interesting to me. Damwon Gaming is a team that is terrible at the late game. JD Gaming is a mixed bag into the late game, but they are terrifying overall still. And G2 is consistent to no end. These 3 teams going off, whoever has the control early game wins. Just hands down, so long as nobody messes up the mid game. And that's just the thing. It's so long that nobody messes up the mid game, then you're good. Group B is going to be the most fun to watch. Whoever slots in there as the 4th seed, my goodness. Best of luck to you. Yeah. You're going to have a hard time, buddy. Group C. Rogue, I mentioned in the playoffs that if Rogue keep up their momentum here, and the momentum that they had beating Fnatic and G2, that this could be an incredibly competitive top 4 team. I'm not confident they're actually going to keep up that momentum. Again, patch adjustments. Things are really tight in terms of the scheduling. So it's really tight. It's really hard to tell. GAM is back on form. They had a bit of a hiccup during their summer season and a bit of a hiccup during the playoffs, but as they rolled up into the lower bracket, they looked a lot more confident into the ways that they play. And oh boy, I wouldn't want to be in the way of GAM. And Top Esports were the closest competitors to JD Gaming. Both of these teams are equally terrifying in their approach. I would toss up between JD Gaming and Top Esports as 1st and 2nd seed, with JD Gaming having been the slightly more consistent team in terms of getting the win. So if I was to toss up things right now, as the teams show up, it would be Rogue and Top Esports that would move on, depending on like who the 4th seed comes in to go for this. Because if it's DRX that comes in, no, actually, even if it's DRX that comes in, Top and Rogue, as they stand right now, would move on. But if Rogue doesn't keep up, I would see Gam and Top move on. Let's go to Group D. Group D, the crowd in the draw stage thought that 100 Thieves had a strong chance to make it through. Here's the thing, guys. If the seeding is as it is right now, and Royal Never Give Up are the most likely team to go through, you end up with a Group D with Royal Never Give Up in it. And the Flying Oysters are significantly more consistent than 100 Thieves. I do not have confidence that the 100 Thieves are going to be able to perform in Group D. As much as it looks like the easy group, none of the 4 groups here look easy to handle, at least not in the perspective of North America. Hell, not even in any perspective of any region. It will be tough, just in general, just to make first seed or first place in these groups. Gen G and JDG are the only 2 teams that I have utmost confidence they'll 100% go out. Well, those are that's at least how I think from the way things roll out. We'll see how play-ins go. We'll see how the meta changes, on and so forth. That's what I got there. So, those were my thoughts overall on all the playoffs, or at least my immediate thoughts, my concerns, and also I'm excited for Worlds. I do think that this will be an incredibly competitive World if the patch is handled properly, or if the teams have the proper adequate time to set up. I don't think so, but even if that doesn't happen, I have an inking suspicion this will be a very competitive Worlds. I don't have a lot of confidence for North America. I have some confidence for Vietnam. I have some confidence for the PCS in Southeast Asia. Many of the lower seeded legacy teams are going to have a really rough time, and it's going to be a race between Top, JDG, and Gen G. But it's Worlds. Everyone is surprised at what happens at Worlds. And last year, everybody thought it was going to be a one-sided slosh where Damwon Gaming Kia was just going to like steamroll through the whole thing, as well as Fun Plus, and neither those 2 things did not happen. So we'll see. I'm really excited. I do want to hear what you guys have to say in the comments down below. This video is probably already so long enough as it is. I really appreciate all of those who watch, even bits and pieces of it. It's super appreciated. I will have plenty of other videos ready for explanations of each individual team. But with that, I'll see you all next time, and I'll see you all at Worlds. Thank you all for watching. Have a good one.